As you probably know, Levy Rozman, aka Gotham Chess, has restarted his quest for the Grandmaster title. He just played a tournament in Madrid, Spain, where he performed very well. Didn't end up making a Grandmaster norm, but had some pretty impressive play. In one of those games, he used one knight f3, which is an opening I've put a lot of work into. I have a chessable course on it, so I thought let's analyze this game and see what we can learn from it. Okay, Levy is white versus Diego Macias Pino, who's 24, I believe a grandmaster, 2471, strong opponent. He starts with one knight f3, black plays d5, and Levy goes g3. Now black plays knight d7. This is an interesting move. The idea is to play e5 and set up that classical pawn center with e5, d5. So it's somewhat similar to the move knight c6, which I've noticed I'm doing a speed run right now. This is extremely common at lower rating levels. Same idea to play e5. And the usual reaction to either of these moves is to play d4 to stop black from playing d5. Why would black play knight d7? Well, after d4 and d5 happen, this knight on c6 blocks the c pawn, which can be a little awkward in a double queen pawn structure. Often you want to advance that pawn, either to support d5 or even to c5 to start pressuring d4. So black's idea is they are threatening e5, not exactly forcing us to play d4, but sort of provoking us to play d4 without blocking the c pawn. On the other hand, of course, black is blocking the bishop on c8, so it's a trade-off. Anyways, Levy plays d4, and now black plays knight b6. So pretty weird opening play, moving the same piece twice. Our usual kind of bread and butter opening principles are don't move the same piece twice in the opening because you want to get all your pieces in play as quickly as possible. So this looks pretty fishy, but it's actually something that's been played by a lot of grandmasters. So there is some logic to this setup. One of the ideas is that white's usual pawn break here, c4, is now going to be much harder to achieve because the knight's controlling that square. So Levy plays bishop g2. Let's just play through the opening. We're going to come back at the end and talk a little bit about the theory. And there's some subtleties with move orders here, but let's just go continue. Bishop g2. Of course, this is the usual square for the bishop. Bishop f5, and this is black usually goes for sort of a Londonish setup here, like bishop f5, e6, knight f6, just with this knight over on b6. a4. So Levy decides to flick this in. Black more or less has to play a5 because you don't want to let this knight get chased around and this pawn advance to a6 to soften up the queen side. So white can insert these two moves. It's probably worth doing because it kind of loosens the support of this knight, and black can't support a5 with a pawn, so probably slightly benefits white to have these two moves in, but it doesn't make a huge change really. Now castles, e6. And here as white is where you have to think about a plan. So if you want, you could pause the video and think about what you would do here. Levy played knight c3, which again initially should look a little bit strange because I've just gone on about how this knight on c6 or on c3 is typically not well placed in a double queen pawn structure. But the fact that black has this knight on c6 means that our usual pawn break with c4 is much more difficult to achieve. So white kind of has to come up with another plan. So the idea of knight c3 is actually now we're going to go for e4 instead. And this is a good plan. So black plays bishop e7. The point of this is one of white's other ideas related to e4 is to go knight h4. So first of all, hitting this bishop, if given the chance, white will trade that off and get the bishop pair, and also opening up this bishop to support the idea of e4. So black prevented that. Levy played rook e1, continuing to set up e4, and now black kind of had to play knight f6, both to prevent e4 and just at some point you're going to have to develop that knight and castle. It's kind of hard to find another useful move. So then knight h4, the bishop is blocked. So we can go ahead and do this. Castles takes, queen d3 hitting the pawn, Knight e4. Could also have played queen d7 or g6. But knight e4 is okay. f3. This chases the knight away and continues to support this idea of e4. Knight takes c3. Okay, here's another quiz for you. Pause the video. How do you recapture that knight? With the queen or the pawn? Levy took with the pawn, which is certainly a good decision because there's a tactical flaw with queen takes c3. Bishop b4 would happen. That is a skewer. Your queen has to move and you're going to lose a whole rook. Not good. So b takes c3. Normally we would want to avoid doubled pawns, but because of that tactic, this is absolutely forced. But even positionally, there's some upsides to this. It does weaken the c4 square and the a4 pawn, but it also reinforces the center, gives us an open b file to work with, and having that d4 pawn defended like this is going to be especially nice after white plays e4. g6, white was threatening to take on f5, e4, and takes. Now, interestingly, the engine likes not taking. It wants to play something like rook e8, and after e takes f5, just ignore this and just sacrifice a pawn. So black would be down a pawn here, but this bishop is kind of weak. This pawn is under some pressure. White's position's a little bit discoordinated. So interesting line, but from black's perspective, in a practical game, I think it would be difficult to sacrifice a pawn without really clear compensation or any sort of attack or initiative. Just positionally, it's a bit of a surprising move. So I'm not sure that, or I'm not surprised rather, that black just took on e4. It's certainly the more obvious move. But after these exchanges, this plan with e4 has come to fruition. This bishop is now on a beautiful open diagonal, pressuring a lot of black's pieces. White has this nice central pawn mass that can start to get mobilized. And the bishop pair is at its best in an open position, which position is much more open now that a lot of pawns have been traded. So white is doing well here. Rook b1, just putting the rook on an open file and pressuring this pawn. Rook b8, black defended, and c4, starting to advance those pawns, drive the knight away and gain space in the center. Knight b4, queen d2. This square looks a little awkward for the queen, but you have to keep an eye on both of these pawns. So the options are a bit limited, and it's a fine square, really. So bishop f6. Levy traded a pair of rooks and played c3, kicking that knight out and reinforcing the center. Knight c6, bishop a3. Not a bad move, but it might have been slightly better to develop. So the bishop on this, it's an open diagonal, which is often what we're looking for with bishops, but in a way it's a little bit too open because there's nothing to attack there. It's just sort of hitting on air. So possibly better would be queen f2, hitting the bishop, but black will defend that somehow. But then planning bishop f4, and there's several juicy targets on this diagonal, which would be kind of annoying for black to defend. So I think that would have been a little better, but bishop a3 is okay. Queen d7, queen comes out, hitting the bishop. Bishop drops back, and h4. So I think Levy is thinking about maybe king h2, bishop h3 ideas, maybe h5, kind of asking some questions on the king side rather. Knight d8. And here's my favorite move of the game. Actually, white to play. Have a think about what you would do here. Okay, Levy played d5. Excellent move. And the purpose of this move is all about this knight here blocking both of these squares, completely trapping that knight on the back row where it also blocks the rook. So really excellent move. Restricting black's knight. Very good awareness of the abilities of the pieces. Now, this does seem to leave two pawns hanging, both on a4 and c3. But if queen takes a4, queen takes c7 is a strong reply, counterattacking the rook. And if bishop takes c3, there's nothing really tactically wrong with this move, but basically white just doesn't care about that pawn because that was the doubled pawn anyway. White's bishops are really active. White is dominating the center. This knight is terrible. So white just has tremendous positional compensation for a pawn. So there's many moves you could play, but for instance, just rook c1, chasing the bishop back. Bishop b4 would allow white to take control of that long diagonal, and probably that's going to lead to a quick checkmate. So bishop g7, but then just rook e1, controlling this open file, and it doesn't matter that white's down a pawn. White is absolutely dominating the entire board. In any case, black decided not to take that. Rook c8 and c5, continuing to press forward in the center and also defending this pawn, because black had defended this, so queen takes a4 was possibly a threat, but Levy defended it. Oops, let's see, how do I go forward? Okay, yeah, bishop takes c3, queen e3 hitting the bishop, bishop goes back, and king h2. Maybe thinking about some bishop h3 action here. c6, queen takes a4, I guess is possible, but looks incredibly risky. White could, for instance, play c6, cutting off the queen's retreat and threatening queen e8. So I don't think black can really contemplate grabbing that pawn. c6, rook comes over, threatening queen e8. King f8. So black is trying to keep white's major pieces out of the e-file from infiltrating here, but lining up the king with a bishop it's a bit risky. Queen f4, another excellent move by Levy. The idea is to come in with queen d6 check, forcing a queen trade and creating a passed pawn. And white's position is so dominant that this attack, even in an endgame with the queens off, is still going to be raging. So black goes f5, trying to create an escape square for the king, but I mean, this isn't really going to help. Queen d6 check comes in, c takes d6, and now d7 check, discovered check, hitting the rook is a massive threat. So the rook moved, but again, it doesn't really help. Just d6 check, rook e7 check, king up, and d6. And here black had seen enough and resigned. And yeah, it's not an early resignation at all, because bishop b2 is coming next. Not only winning black's bishop, but actually that would just be straight up checkmate at this point. So black, I don't know if black can even avoid checkmate, but certainly has to give up massive material here. Bishop b2 is coming. There's nothing to do about it. So very impressive win by Levy. We saw that central and bishop pair strategy work. Let's take a quick look at the opening. So knight d7. You're unlikely to face this, I think, unless your opponents are quite high level, because it's not, knight d7 is not an intuitive idea at all. This would have to be something that was prepared specifically. But, you know, if you're playing against advanced club players or masters, you might run into this. d4, preventing e5, and knight b6. And actually, so the plan that Levy went for in the game with knight c3, e4 is absolutely my favorite plan against this setup. I would, in terms of move orders, I think it might be a little more precise to actually just go ahead and play knight c3 immediately, because I kind of know I'm going for this plan, so I'm not waiting to develop the knight. And the reason I like to, I think this works a little better. One reason you might want to do this first is that means once your knight's on c3, you are always ready to meet bishop f5 with knight h4. Whereas in the game, for instance, after bishop g2, if you play knight h4, you might have to be concerned in some cases about bishop e4 as an added option. Now, in this position, I don't know if this is really any good for black. You could still play f3, but could be a concern. So I think it's a little, I just slightly prefer to play knight c3 right away, and then knight h4. And if e6, we would get similar play to the game, where you can play queen d3, then bishop g2, castles, f3, e4. So I would focus more, as long as you understand that plan, the move order is probably not going to make a huge difference, actually. One other idea is, I was wondering what happens if bishop g4, and there's a few ways you can play here, but I kind of like queen d3 stepping out of this pin and continuing to play for e4. And you can also, in all of these lines, you can flick in a4, a5 at some point. So that was the game. Uh, Really impressive game by Levy. Honestly, it showed the kind of a model game showing the typical plans in this line. So remember when this knight comes to b6 and you are not able to go c4, you have this alternative plan with knight c3 and e4, which can work really well.